In the summer of 1871, inside a parish courthouse along the lower Mississippi, a young seamstress named Adeline Rousseau was meant to take the witness stand at 7 o'clock in the morning. She never showed up. The marshal discovered her boarding room door locked from within, her supper cold on the table, her shoes neatly arranged beside the bed, and a single lamp still burning with just enough oil left to prove it had been lit past midnight. What the marshal failed to note in writing, and what the parish register would later leave out for nearly 60 years, was that 3 other people who had been preparing to testify that same week had also gone missing by Friday, and that the riverbank below the courthouse had been dragged twice in silence before the judge declared the trial adjourned indefinitely. In the records that do survive, she is described as 24 years old, unmarried, literate in both French and English, and in possession of a ledger that no one in authority ever admitted to having read. That ledger, according to the one person who ever claimed to have held it, contained the names of 17 men in the parish, along with the sums each had paid to make certain things, and certain people, disappear. Before we go further into the story of Adeline Rousseau and the courthouse at Marchand's Bend, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next, and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from right now. Knowing where you are makes these stories feel less like voices in the dark and more like a conversation between strangers who have agreed, for a little while, not to look away. Now lean in, because what we're about to enter isn't a ghost story. It's a record of what men will do when they believe no one is writing anything down, and what one woman did when she realized, sitting by an oil lamp in a locked room, that the only weapon left to her was the choice of how she would be remembered. To understand what happened to Adeline, you first have to understand the place that swallowed her. Marchand's Bend wasn't a large settlement. Even at its peak, it sat on a horseshoe curve of the Mississippi, about 40 miles downriver from Baton Rouge, where the bluffs gave way to cypress flats, and the air in August was so thick that men said you could chew it between your teeth. The town had been founded in the 1760s by French colonists who had drifted south from the Illinois country. By 1871, its population was a tangled mixture of old Creole families, formerly enslaved people who had stayed on as laborers on the plantations, Cajun farmers from the interior, Irish dockhands who had come up from New Orleans after the war, and a handful of northern agents representing cotton factors in Natchez and Memphis. The parish courthouse stood at the top of a low rise, built of yellow brick that had been fired locally and had already begun to soften at the corners. Its clock tower was the tallest structure for a day's ride in any direction, and when the clock chimed on still nights, you could hear it from the far bank of the river, a slow iron note that carried across the water and into the cypress stands, where it seemed to anyone listening from the riverfront taverns to have come from somewhere underneath the world rather than above it. This was a country of levees and lantern-lit wharves, of sugar cane rotting sweet in the fields after harvest, of mosquitoes that rose out of the swamps in clouds so dense they left welts on horses. The roads in from the interior were little more than ruts that turned to black mud in the rain and fine gray dust in the summer. That dust settled on everything, on the shoulders of men's coats, on the windowsills of the boarding houses, on the linens the washerwomen hung out to dry behind the alleys on the south end of town. It was also a country in the middle of a long and bitter rearrangement. The war had ended only 6 years before, and the men who had once ruled Marchand's Bend were learning slowly, and with great resentment, that the ruling was no longer entirely theirs. The parish had a federal garrison of 12 soldiers billeted in a requisitioned warehouse near the steamer landing. It had a Republican sheriff imposed from Baton Rouge, a heavy-set man with a limp from Shiloh whom nobody in the old families would invite to dinner. It had 3 newspapers, 2 of which printed in the careful, coded language of the Reconstruction press, reminders of what had been and suggestions of what might return. And beneath all of that, it had a quieter rearrangement, the rearrangement of money. The cotton trade was shifting. The sugar economy had been gutted, and the old fortunes were being replaced by newer ones, built on methods the old fortunes had used too, but which they had never before been obliged to write down in 2 separate sets of books. Adeline herself was not a native of the parish. She had arrived in 1867 from a small settlement farther south in the Bayou country, brought in by an aunt who kept a boarding house on Rue Delacroix, 2 blocks from the courthouse square. The aunt, a widow named Odile Fontenot, rented rooms almost exclusively to young women who worked in the shops and dressmaking houses of the town, and she ran her home with the quiet severity of a convent. The parlor clock was not permitted to run slow. The front door was bolted at 9. No gentlemen callers were allowed past the front hallway, and every young woman who stayed there understood, without ever being told in so many words, that the preservation of a boarding house of respectable girls in Marchand's Bend in the year 1871 depended on the preservation of appearances, and that appearances, in Odille's understanding, were not the opposite of truth, but its outer armor. Adeline was slender, with the dark hair of her mother's people and the pale gray eyes of a Norman grandfather she had never met. She had inherited from that grandfather a habit of listening with her eyes half lowered, which people sometimes mistook for shyness, but which was, in fact, attention. She took in sewing, and by the spring of 1871 she had built a clientele that included the wives of cotton factors, the daughters of the parish judge, and 2 prominent women from the Catholic Charity Society. Her hands were quick and her mouth was quiet, in a town where almost everyone believed they knew everyone else's business. She was regarded as a person who kept her own counsel. She was also, by every account, devout in a soft and unobtrusive way, attending 6 o'clock Mass on Sunday mornings at the small brick church behind the courthouse, and bringing communion to an elderly neighbor who could no longer walk. She had one suitor, a bookkeeper at the cotton warehouse named Julien Marchand, who had asked her twice to marry him and been gently declined both times, though she continued to walk with him along the levee on Sunday afternoons. Julien was a patient man, 26 years old, with a soft brown beard and eyes that squinted from too many years over ledgers. He had told a friend at the warehouse in the winter of 1870 that he intended to keep asking Adeline once a year for as long as it took, because he believed that a woman who said no twice was not a woman who meant never, but merely a woman who meant not yet. There is nothing else in the surviving descriptions of Adeline that would have marked her for attention. She was, in almost every visible sense, an ordinary young woman of her class and station, which was perhaps exactly the reason someone chose her to keep the ledger. The ledger itself did not belong to Adeline. It belonged, or had belonged, to a man named Augustin Delacroix, a cotton broker of middling reputation and considerable private wealth, who had died in February of 1871 under circumstances that the parish physician listed as sudden apoplexy, and that several of the man's household servants later described privately as something nearer to a violent and panicked poisoning. Delacroix had kept 2 sets of books for most of his adult life. One tracked his official business, bales purchased, warehousing fees, shipments to New Orleans, notes owed to the Baton Rouge banks. The other tracked a different kind of commerce, one that had begun in a small way during the war, when a number of men in the parish discovered that displaced persons, lost property, and disputed titles created opportunities for men willing to handle certain matters without the complication of paperwork. By the time Delacroix died, the second ledger had grown to 183 pages, and according to the single witness who ever described its contents in any detail, it named 17 men in Marchand's Bend who had purchased services ranging from the intimidation of rival witnesses to the quiet disposal of documents, to the removal of persons who had become inconvenient to the business interests of the parish elite. The first ledger was found on Delacroix's desk the morning after his death. The second was not. His widow, a small and frightened woman named Solange, found it 3 weeks later, wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose floorboard in her late husband's study. After sitting with it for 2 nights, she brought it in a sewing basket to the boarding house of Odile Fontenot, who was her cousin. She came at dusk in a plain black shawl and sat in Odile's kitchen for nearly an hour without speaking, drinking cup after cup of coffee that had gone cold. When at last she pushed the sewing basket across the table, she said only that she could no longer sleep with the thing in her house, that Odile would understand when she opened it, and that she hoped Odile would forgive her for bringing it, because there was no one else in the parish she trusted with a secret that heavy. Odile, by her own later account, did not open the basket until Solange had left. When she did, she stood for a long time at her kitchen table, holding the oilcloth package in her hands, reading the first 3 pages by the light of a single candle. Then she wrapped it up again, climbed the stairs to the top floor, and hid it in the cedar-lined linen chest at the foot of Adeline's bed, because Adeline's room was the only room in the house with a bolt on the door that still worked, and because Odile had understood, in that moment, that she was not a woman strong enough to carry the thing alone, and that the one person in her house who might be strong enough was the one she most wished to protect. She told no one, not even Adeline, what was inside. Or so Odile later claimed. The events that brought Adeline to the witness stand began in April, when a laborer named Amos Carrier was found dead at the foot of the levee. He was a man of perhaps 40 who had worked as a teamster for one of the old sugar plantations, and who had, in the preceding months, begun to file claims for wages unpaid since before emancipation. He had been a quiet man by all accounts, a widower, a Methodist, a father of 3 grown daughters, and he had come to the federal agent's office in Baton Rouge twice that winter, carrying carefully written statements he had dictated to a schoolteacher in exchange for a week's labor on her woodpile. The parish authorities ruled his death a drowning. They noted in the brief report filed by the deputy coroner that his pockets had been empty, that his boots had been missing, and that the back of his skull showed the kind of injury the coroner described as consistent with a fall against rocks in shallow water. 2 of his co-workers, both black freedmen named Solomon Wade and Marcus Toussaint, came forward within a week to say that Carrier had been beaten behind the cotton warehouse on the night of his death and thrown into the river afterward, and that they had seen 3 white men standing over him in the lantern light, and that one of the 3 had been the foreman of the warehouse, a man named Jonas Aubry, whose family had been named in the published obituary of Augustine Delacroix as among the late broker's closest business associates. Under ordinary circumstances in the parish, such a claim would have produced no indictment and no investigation. The sheriff would have listened or not. The deputy coroner would have filed the report or amended it. Life would have resumed. But 1871 was not an ordinary year. A federal circuit judge named Elias Winthrop had been appointed to oversee civil rights enforcement in the lower Mississippi districts, and Winthrop was not from Louisiana. He was a veteran, a former Union colonel, a man in his 50s with a short gray beard and a bad knee from a musket ball at Spotsylvania. He believed, with the narrow and unshakable conviction of a New England Congregationalist, that the reconstruction of the South depended on the willingness of the federal courts to convict white men for crimes they had previously committed without consequence. Winthrop did not shout. He did not make speeches. He did not give interviews to the newspapers. He simply read and wrote and issued subpoenas with a steady, methodical patience that his clerk said reminded him of a man carving a channel into stone with a pocket knife. Winthrop scheduled a grand jury for the first week of July, and he subpoenaed not only the 2 witnesses who had come forward, but any person in the parish known to have had dealings with Augustine Delacroix, on the theory that Delacroix's second ledger, rumors of which had reached Baton Rouge, might contain information relevant to a pattern of organized violence against freedmen in the cotton trade. Adeline Rousseau's name appeared on the subpoena list because Odile Fontenot's name had been on the list first, and because when the federal marshal knocked on the boarding house door in the hot drizzle of a June afternoon, Odile, terrified and ill with a fever that had begun the night before, had pointed down the hallway and said that her niece was the one who could speak to what was kept in the linen chest. That is how, in the last week of June 1871, a 24-year-old seamstress with no living parents and no surviving brothers came to be the one person in Marchand's Bend who could put a ledger on the record and name, one by one, the men who had paid Augustine Delacroix to make things and people disappear. She had read it by then. She had read it against her aunt's implicit wishes, sitting by the oil lamp in her room with the door bolted and the shutters closed, listening to the small noises of the house settling around her. The creak of the staircase, the soft tick of the parlor clock 2 floors below, the occasional bark of a dog from the levee road. She read all 183 pages in 7 nights. On the first night, she read only the opening pages, then set it down and went to bed, and lay awake until dawn. On the second night, she read for 3 hours and went downstairs at midnight to make herself tea. Odile, who had not been sleeping either, came to the kitchen door and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Neither of them said anything. Adeline carried her tea back upstairs. Odile returned to her bedroom. On the 3rd night, Adeline began to keep notes in a small cloth-bound book she kept in the bottom of her sewing basket, written in a personal shorthand that combined French abbreviations with a cipher of her own invention, substituting letters of the alphabet by the numerical position of saints' days in the liturgical calendar. By the fifth night, she had begun to recognize patterns. By the sixth, she had begun to recognize names. And when she closed it on the seventh night, she understood, with the clarity of a person raised in a country where certain lessons were taught young, that she was now the most dangerous woman in the parish, and that the only thing protecting her was the fact that most of the 17 men did not yet know she existed. She did not sleep at all that seventh night. She sat in the wooden chair by the window with the shutters closed and the lamp guttering, watching the faint seam of gray slowly grow between the slats as dawn came up over the river. She thought about her mother, who had died when Adeline was 11, of the fever that swept through the bayou in the autumn of 1858, who had taught her to sew by candlelight, and who, on the last night of her life, had held Adeline's hand and told her that the one thing no one could ever take from her was the careful attention of her own mind. She thought about her father, who had died at Shiloh, whose face she could no longer remember clearly, but whose voice she could still summon in moments of quiet. A slow, deep voice that had always spoken French at home and English only in the market. She thought about the walks along the levee with Julian Marchand, about the 6 o'clock mass at the small brick church, about the elderly neighbor to whom she brought communion, and she understood that none of those things would protect her, and that none of the men named in the ledger would hesitate, because the men named in the ledger had already demonstrated, repeatedly, that hesitation was not among their habits. And she understood something else, which took her by surprise. She understood that she was not afraid. She was something else, something colder and quieter than fear. In the days that followed, she would come to recognize it as the particular stillness of a person who has made a decision before she knows she has made it. The deposition was scheduled for the morning of July 5th. The marshal came for her at dawn, in a light summer rain, the kind that in Louisiana smells of cypress bark and iron. He found the door of her room locked from the inside. Odile unlocked it with her own key, a thin brass key that had hung on a black ribbon around her neck for as long as anyone could remember. The two of them stood in the doorway and looked at what the room contained and did not contain. The bed had been slept in, or at least disturbed. The coverlet was pulled back at the corner. The pillow bore the shallow print of a head that had lain there for at least an hour. The supper on the small pine table was cold but untouched, a plate of rice and red beans, a single piece of bread broken in half, and a pewter cup of water beside it, still full. Her shoes, the black leather walking boots she wore to mass, were placed side by side at the foot of the bed, as though she had meant to put them on in the morning and had, at some point in the night, decided not to. The oil lamp on the writing desk still had a thin film of smoke on its chimney, which meant it had burned long past the hour at which she was known to retire. Her second-best dress, the green one she had pressed the afternoon before to wear to the courthouse, hung on the back of the door, still pressed, the sleeves smooth, the collar sharp, a small sprig of lavender tucked into the breast pocket. Her Bible lay open on the dresser, face down, to the book of Judith. And on the desk, in the center of the blotter, was a single sheet of paper on which she had written, in her careful schoolmistress hand, the phrase, "I will not take another name," followed by 3 initials that nobody in the room recognized, and nothing else. The linen chest at the foot of the bed was open. The ledger was gone. So was Adeline. No window was broken. No floorboard disturbed. The shutters were locked from the inside with a small iron pin dropped through the latch, as they were every night before she went to bed. The bolt on the door had been thrown from the inside, and that bolt, as anyone who had ever tried to enter the room knew, was stiff with age and made a particular sound when thrown, audible from 2 rooms away. The only way out of that room, if she had left it alive, was through a door she could not have locked behind her. And yet the room was empty. The marshal, whose name was Daniel Kearney, and who had fought with the Irish Brigade at Antietam, stood in the doorway for nearly a full minute before he said anything. He was a tall man, gaunt in the way older Irishmen become gaunt, with a long graying beard and eyes the color of wet slate, and a scar that began at the hairline above his left eye and ran down into the beard. He had a habit, when he was thinking, of rubbing that scar with the side of his thumb. He rubbed it now. When he finally spoke, he spoke in a low voice to Odile. He asked whether she was certain her niece had been in the room when she retired for the night. Odile said she was certain. Her voice, she said afterward, felt to her as though it were coming from the next room. She said she had brought Adeline a cup of chicory coffee at 9, and that they had spoken for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Adeline had been calm but pale, and had said she would sleep well because she had made her peace with God and with the testimony she was going to give. Odile said she had heard her niece throw the bolt after her, because the bolt on that door was stiff and had a particular sound when thrown. She said she had gone to bed herself just after 10, that the house had been quiet all night, and that she had not heard a single footstep on the stairs. Kearney walked around the room twice. He looked under the bed. He tested the shutters. He stood on a chair and examined the ceiling. He lifted the Bible on the dresser and looked beneath it, then set it back down exactly as he had found it, face down on the book of Judith. Then he asked Odile to leave the room, and he stood alone in it for a long time. Odile, standing in the hallway, heard him do two things: open the linen chest and close it again, and murmur very softly something in Irish, a word she did not understand, a word she later believed was a prayer. When he came out, his face was the color of tallow, and he said only that this was no longer a matter for the marshal's office. It was a matter for Judge Winthrop. And that night, two other witnesses on Winthrop's list disappeared. Marcus Toussaint, the freedman who had worked beside Amos Carrier on the plantation, and who had come forward to describe the beating behind the warehouse, was last seen at a small tavern on the riverfront at 10:30, walking out into the rain with a friend who said he saw Toussaint turn north along the levee path, and then lost sight of him in the dark. Toussaint did not arrive home. His wife, a woman named Cora, waited all night with a lantern in the window. At first light, she went out along the path with a cousin, calling his name. They found nothing but soft black mud and the deep silence of the cypress. By mid-morning, 3 more men had joined the search. By noon, one of Toussaint's shoes was found at the edge of the river, half sunk in the mud, the laces still tied. No body was ever recovered. The other witness, a white shopkeeper named Edward Wren, who had done business with Delacroix and had been prepared to testify about certain payments recorded in the first ledger, the one intended to conceal the second, simply failed to open his store on the morning of the 6th. His clerk, a boy of 14 named Thomas, who had worked there for 2 years, found the store locked, the till untouched, and a half-drunk cup of tea on the counter behind the ribbon rack. Wren's hat and coat were still on their hook. His horse was still in the stable. The rear door of the shop was bolted from the inside, just as Adeline's had been. The clerk, standing in that small back room in the gray morning light, said afterward that he had the sudden and unshakable feeling that he was standing in a place where someone had been only a few minutes before, and that whoever had taken them had been careful, patient, and unhurried. By Friday, Judge Winthrop had lost 3 of his 4 witnesses. By Saturday, the grand jury had been dismissed. By the following Tuesday, the second ledger, the entire reason for the proceeding, was officially considered by the parish authorities to have never existed at all. If this story is holding you, now is the moment to press like. It tells me you want the channel to keep digging into these records, and it pushes these stories toward other people who might actually want to hear them. Share it with someone who loves dark history, and if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the bell. There is more of Marchand's Bend to come, and I want you with me when we get to it. Decades later, in the years after the First World War, a young woman named Marguerite Leclerc came to Marchand's Bend from New Orleans to settle the estate of an aunt who had died without direct heirs. The aunt had been a daughter of Odile Fontenot, and the boarding house on Rue Delacroix had passed to her, and from her, in 1919, to Marguerite. The house had been shuttered for 2 years by then. The rooms were dusty. The kitchen smelled faintly of mice and of coffee grounds left in a tin on a shelf for a decade. Marguerite was 26, a slender woman with her grandmother's pale gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, trained as a schoolteacher, engaged to a printer she had met at a lecture on the suffrage movement in Chicago. She had come south for a month to sort through what remained. Most of the house was sold or given away within the first 3 weeks. But in the attic, in a locked tin trunk that had not been opened in at least 40 years, she found a bundle of papers tied with black ribbon. Among those papers was a letter sealed in wax, addressed in a careful schoolmistress hand to a person who did not exist. The envelope read simply, "To the one who asks." Marguerite sat on the attic floor in the dusty amber light coming through the small round window, turning the envelope over in her hands for nearly 5 minutes before she opened it. The letter was dated the 3rd of July, 1871, 2 days before Adeline's disappearance. It had been written in French and ran to nearly 7 pages. It began with an account of how the ledger had come into the boarding house, how Adeline had been told to keep it in her linen chest, and how she had, against her aunt's explicit instructions, read it. It described what she had read. It named 6 of the 17 men, and it set out, in the plain and methodical prose of a woman taught to keep household accounts, what each of them had paid Augustine Delacroix for, and when, and how much. It described the death of a dock worker in 1866, whose body had been weighted and sunk in the river off the old sugar wharf, and named the 2 men who had paid $40 for the disposal and the man who had received the payment, along with the exact night the weighting had been done. It described the forced removal of a freedman family in 1868, whose claim to land near the bayou had been inconveniently supported by a written deed, and the arson of the small cabin in which that family had lived, naming the 3 men who had purchased the arson, the 2 men who had carried the lanterns, and the child of 4 who had died of smoke inhalation in a back room. It described the disappearance of a young midwife in 1869, whose only crime had been telling 3 pregnant women that the doctor they had been sent to was a drunk who had killed 2 patients, describing the method by which she had been silenced, involving a staged elopement, a forged letter to her family, and a shallow grave in a cane field 12 miles north of town. Each of these accounts was set down without elaboration or outrage, as though Adeline had understood that her only protection against being dismissed as hysterical was to write like a clerk. And then, near the end of the letter, the tone shifted. The last 2 pages were something else. They described a visit she had received on the evening of the 1st of July, for days before her deposition. A man had come to the boarding house at dusk. He had not given his name, but Odile had shown him up to the parlor, and Adeline had been summoned. The man was not a stranger. She recognized him as the eldest son of one of the men named in the ledger, a planter from the north end of the parish whose family had lost most of its land in the war and was rebuilding its fortune through the cotton trade. He was perhaps 35 years old, well dressed in a dark gray frock coat of a cut that had come in from New Orleans that spring, quiet in his manner, clean-shaven, with hands that showed no labor and a gold ring on his smallest finger. He had, Adeline wrote, the particular calm of a man who had made a decision he did not expect to be disputed. He sat across from her in the small parlor, in the ladder-back chair by the fireplace. Odile brought coffee, then, at a glance from the man, withdrew. He waited until the parlor door had closed behind her. Then he spoke. He told her that he understood she had been subpoenaed, and that he understood she was in possession of certain papers, and that he had come to propose a transaction. He said that he could see, from the quality of her sewing and the modesty of her circumstances, that she was a woman of limited means and considerable intelligence, and that such a combination was rarely rewarded in the world as it presently existed. He said he was authorized by persons he did not name to offer her $2,000 in gold, and passage to any city she chose, east or west, and a letter of introduction to respectable families in that city who would receive her as a gentlewoman of reduced circumstances. He named the families. The names were familiar. One of them belonged to a woman for whom Adeline had, for months earlier, sewn a wedding gown. He said that, in exchange, she was to hand over the ledger, withdraw from her testimony on grounds of conscience, and leave the parish within 48 hours. He said the alternative was one she would not enjoy, though he phrased it with great delicacy. He said the parish had, he believed, already demonstrated what could happen to persons who insisted on carrying burdens that did not belong to them. He paused. He looked at her with something like regret. He said he wanted her to understand that the offer was a kindness, and that it was the last kindness that would be offered. Then he waited. She wrote that he waited with a patience she found more frightening than any shouting could have been, because he was not a hot-tempered man, and he was not cruel in the way a beast is cruel. He was simply a man prepared to destroy her with the same administrative efficiency with which he would have foreclosed on a farm. Adeline wrote that she had looked at him for a long time, and that she had felt, for the first time in her adult life, the full weight of what it meant to be a woman in a place like Marchand's Bend in a year like 1871. And then she wrote that she had understood, in that moment, that the 17 men in the ledger were not a conspiracy so much as a system, and that the system was older than any of them, and that it would survive all of them, and that whether she took the gold and fled, or handed over the ledger and stayed, the system would not be dismantled by her testimony or by her silence. She wrote that she had thought briefly, and with a kind of distant amusement, about how she would describe the moment to Julian Marchand, if she could ever describe it to anyone, and that she had understood she could not, and that the inability to tell him was itself a kind of wound, a small, cold wound she could not yet name. And then she wrote something that changes the entire meaning of this case. She wrote that she had asked the man a single question. She had asked him who had sent him. He had smiled very slightly and said that no one had sent him, that he had come on his own, because the other 16 were prepared to take measures he considered distasteful, and he had wished to spare her, and himself, that distastefulness. He said the others would come on the night of the 4th, if she had not gone by then, and that what they would do, she would not survive. Adeline thanked him for the warning and asked him to leave. He left. She wrote that she had sat alone in the parlor for nearly an hour afterward, and that she had realized, with a peculiar and almost weightless calm, that she had been given not a choice between life and death, but a choice between two different kinds of disappearance. To take the gold was to disappear as a person who had once mattered. To stay was to disappear as a body. And to do the third thing, the thing she had begun to plan as she sat there alone in the parlor while the clock in the tower struck 11, was to disappear as something else entirely. The letter ended there, with a signature and a date, and a note that she had written it in case the worst should come to pass, and someone, someday, should want to know what she had chosen and why. When Marguerite Leclerc read the letter in 1919, she did not immediately tell anyone. She had grown up in New Orleans hearing rumors of a cousin who had vanished in the years after the war, but her mother had always refused to speak of it, and the rumors had never included names. Marguerite sat with the letter for 3 days. She read it a second time, and a third. On the 4th morning, she walked down to the parish courthouse carrying the letter in her handbag and asked to see the records of the grand jury that had convened in July of 1871. The clerk, a young man with oiled hair and a celluloid collar, told her politely that no such grand jury had ever convened. Marguerite produced a printed reference to it from a published memoir of Judge Elias Winthrop, who had died in Vermont in 1903. The clerk excused himself for nearly half an hour. When he returned, he was accompanied by a man who introduced himself as the parish attorney, a thin, careful person in his 60s, whose family name Marguerite recognized with a jolt she hoped did not show on her face. It was one of the 6 names from her cousin's letter. The parish attorney was named Courtier. He invited her into his office, offered her coffee, and listened to her describe the letter without asking to see it. He did not write anything down. Then he told her, in the gentle and regretful tone of a man explaining that a roof cannot be repaired because the timbers are rotten through, that the documents she sought had been destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1884, that the memoir she had cited was known to contain inaccuracies, and that the family name of the young woman she was inquiring about did not appear in any parish record he could locate. He suggested, with the same gentleness, that perhaps her cousin had run off with a man and started a new life elsewhere, as young women sometimes did, and that it would be a kindness to the memory of the family to let the matter rest. He walked her to the door. He shook her hand. His hand was dry and cool, the hand of a man who had never done physical labor in his life. And on the street outside, in the bright October light, Marguerite understood 2 things at once. The first was that the parish attorney had known the name of her cousin before she had spoken it. The second was that the letter in her handbag was now the most dangerous object in Marchand's Bend, just as the ledger had been 48 years before, and that the patience which had waited for Adeline in a darkened parlor in 1871 was, in its slow and institutional way, still waiting. She walked back to the boarding house by a different route than the one she had taken that morning. She did not stop at the hotel, where she had left her midday meal on the table. She did not speak to anyone she passed. She packed her trunk that afternoon. She left on the first train the following morning. And she did not set foot in Louisiana again for the rest of her life. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Marchand's Bend turns out to be something stranger and more patient than we had reason to expect. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what actually happened in that room on Rue Delacroix on the night of the 4th of July, 1871, because we are not done yet. Marguerite took the letter with her to New Orleans, and then from New Orleans to Chicago, where she married the printer in 1922 and raised 2 daughters. The letter sat for another 40 years in a safe deposit box at a bank on Dearborn Street. She told her husband about it once, in 1931, on a winter evening when snow was piling against the kitchen window and the radio was playing a program about the Scopes trial. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said that he thought the letter belonged to history, and that the right thing was probably to give it, someday, to a historian who knew what to do with it.